A racist cop pulls over a black teen, humiliating him in front of a crowd, convinced he's just another nobody. But when the teen makes a single phone call, the cop's arrogance shatters, because he just learned the boy is the billionaire heir to an empire. And when you hear what happens next, you'll be shocked. The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet streets of Brookridge, a wealthy suburb known for its pristine roads and high-end boutiques. The day had been uneventful for Officer Daniel Grayson, a man who had spent years patrolling these streets, believing he knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. That's when he saw the car. A sleek, jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom gliding through the intersection, its deep chrome accents reflecting the evening light like polished armor. Grayson's eyes narrowed. He had patrolled this area long enough to know the usual faces, the rich and powerful who called this town home. But behind the wheel of this multi-million-dollar vehicle sat a young black teen, alone. His fingers twitched over the dashboard. Suspicious. With a flick of his wrist, the red and blue lights burst to life, slicing through the golden hour glow. The siren let out a short, sharp wail as he accelerated, tailing the luxury car like a predator stalking its prey. Inside the Rolls-Royce, 17-year-old Elijah Carter felt his stomach tighten. Not again. This wasn't the first time. He had grown up knowing that no matter what his family name was, no matter how much wealth they had, some people would always see his skin before they saw anything else. His father, Marcus Carter, the billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, had prepared him for moments like these. Stay calm, his father had always told him. Stay respectful, but never let anyone take your dignity. Elijah exhaled slowly and pulled over to the side of the road. He watched in the rearview mirror as the officer stepped out of his squad car, his posture stiff, his hand hovering over his holster. Why does he already see me as a threat? Grayson approached the driver's side window, his face unreadable beneath his dark sunglasses. License and registration, he barked, his voice cold and impatient. Elijah reached into the glove compartment with slow, deliberate movements, pulling out the necessary documents. He handed them over without a word, his expression neutral. Grayson barely glanced at them before scoffing. "Where'd you steal this car, kid?" Elijah felt a sharp sting in his chest, but he refused to flinch. "I didn't steal it," he said evenly. "It's mine." Grayson let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, really? A kid like you, driving a car like this? You expect me to believe that?" A crowd had started to gather on the sidewalk. People were pulling out their phones, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. The air was thick with tension, a silent question hanging between them all. Would this escalate? Grayson wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "Tell me, what's the scam? You running drugs? Or did Daddy's credit card finally max out?" Elijah clenched his jaw, feeling the heat rise in his chest. But he didn't take the bait. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. One call. That's all it would take. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed the name that made his heart steady again. The line rang once, twice. Then, "Son, is everything okay?" The deep, commanding voice of Marcus Carter filled the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Elijah met Grayson's gaze, his expression calm but unwavering. "Dad," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think you need to talk to this officer." The color drained from Grayson's face. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and he was about to find out. For a moment, there was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that wrapped around Officer Grayson like a noose. His eyes flicked between Elijah and the phone in his hand, uncertainty creeping into his once confident stance. Then, Marcus Carter's voice boomed through the speaker. "Elijah, what's going on?" Elijah didn't blink. He didn't stutter. He spoke with the calm authority he had learned from his father. I got pulled over, Dad. Officer Grayson here doesn't believe this is my car. On the other end, there was a sharp pause. Then, a slow, measured response. Put him on the phone. Elijah held the phone out, his face unreadable. He'd like to speak with you. Grayson hesitated. His instinct was to refuse, to assert his authority. But the name, Marcus Carter, echoed in his mind. It was familiar. Too familiar. And then, it hit him. Marcus Carter. The billionaire. The real estate mogul. The man who owned half the luxury properties in this city. The man whose name was etched on skyscrapers, business towers, and, most importantly, the checkbooks of people who had more power in their pinky finger than Grayson had in his entire career. His throat went dry. Still, his pride clung to him like a vice. He grabbed the phone roughly and put it to his ear. "This is Officer Grayson." The voice that answered was calm, controlled, but laced with something that made Grayson's stomach turn. Power. "Officer Grayson," Marcus said slowly, "I suggest you explain to me, very carefully, why my son is calling me right now instead of driving home in his own car." Grayson swallowed, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Sir, I was just conducting a routine stop, making sure everything was in order." "Routine?" Marcus repeated, his voice dipping into dangerous territory. "My son was stopped because you assumed he couldn't possibly own that car, isn't that right?" Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? That he had profiled the boy the moment he saw him, that the only crime Elijah had committed was being black behind the wheel of a car that cost more than his entire pension. "Don't bother lying," Marcus interrupted. "You see, Officer Grayson, I have a habit of recording every call my son makes to me, just in case something like this happens." Grayson's blood ran cold. His mind raced. If this conversation was being recorded, that meant... Marcus exhaled, but it wasn't a sigh of relief. It was the exhale of a man who had power, patience, and the means to dismantle someone's entire life with a single phone call. "I have lawyers, officer, the best in the country. I have connections that run deep. So, let me ask you something." Grayson held his breath. "Do you really want to be the cop who made headlines for harassing a billionaire's son?" The words hit like a hammer. Grayson could already see it. His name plastered across news outlets, his face on every screen, his career crumbling before his eyes. He could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, the people recording. The fact that no matter what he did now, this wouldn't just go away. He had made a mistake. A very, very big mistake. His jaw tightened as he forced himself to meet Elijah's gaze. The boy didn't look smug. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. Like this was nothing new to him. And somehow, that made it worse. Grayson cleared his throat, forcing out the words that felt like poison in his mouth. "You're free to go." Elijah didn't move right away. He studied the officer carefully, as if committing this moment to memory. Then, with slow precision, he reached out and took his phone back. "Dad," he said simply, "I think we're done here." Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, in a tone so calm it was terrifying, he said, "No, son, we're not." Grayson's stomach dropped. This wasn't over, not even close. Grayson's fingers twitched as Elijah ended the call. A cold sweat gathered at the back of his neck, and for the first time in his career, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Fear. This was not some random kid he could intimidate. This was not a minor traffic stop that would be forgotten in a few hours. No, this was something much worse. Elijah didn't move right away. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his breathing controlled. But his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes, held something Grayson couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. Elijah knew how this would play out. Grayson did not. The officer stepped back from the car, clearing his throat. "You're free to go," he repeated, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Elijah nodded, slowly rolling the tinted window back up. The Rolls-Royce purred as he shifted into drive, pulling away from the curb like nothing had happened. The crowd that had gathered was still filming, murmuring among themselves. Some were shaking their heads in disappointment. Others looked almost satisfied, like they had just watched the beginning of something much bigger. And they had. Grayson turned, trying to steady himself. He needed to think. Maybe this would blow over. Maybe Carter wouldn't actually do anything. But deep down, he knew better. Officer Grayson sat in the break room of the precinct, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He was trying to calm himself, trying to tell himself that the billionaire had better things to do than go after a cop for a simple misunderstanding. That illusion shattered when Captain Reynolds, his superior, stormed through the door. His face was red with barely contained fury. "Grayson, my office, now." Grayson stood stiffly, his heart pounding. He followed Reynolds down the hall, passing by officers who had their heads down but were clearly listening. They knew something. The moment the office door shut behind them, Reynolds turned on him. "What the hell did you do?" Grayson's stomach twisted. I don't know what you mean." "Cut the crap," Reynolds snapped, shoving his phone onto the desk. The screen was open to a news article, his name in bold letters at the top. "Racist cop harasses billionaire's son in viral video. Marcus Carter promises justice." Grayson's breath caught in his throat. His photo was right there, taken from someone's phone during the stop. The video had already racked up millions of views. But what made his blood freeze was the statement directly from Marcus Carter himself. "No one, no matter their wealth, their influence, or their skin color, should ever have to experience what my son did today. But this is bigger than just Elijah. This is about a system that allows officers like Grayson to harass black men without consequence. That stops today. I will personally ensure that justice is served." Grayson's world tilted. This wasn't going to blow over. Reynolds glared at him, his hands clenched into fists. "You absolute idiot. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Grayson swallowed hard. But before he could get another word out, the phone on Reynolds' desk rang. The captain answered it, his expression shifting from rage to something even worse. Concern. "Yes, sir," he said, listening intently. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Understood." He hung up, turning back to Grayson. His voice was tight, controlled. That was the mayor. Grayson's knees nearly buckled. The mayor. He's getting calls from city officials, from activists, from people in places so high up, I don't even have clearance to talk about them, Reynolds said through gritted teeth. "And do you know what they're all asking?" Grayson stayed silent. "They want to know why you're still wearing that uniform." Grayson felt the floor vanish beneath him. His career, his pension, his entire life. All of it was slipping through his fingers. Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Grayson's mouth went dry. "Captain, you can't—" "Oh, I can," Reynolds snapped. "And if I were you, I'd start looking for a lawyer. Because Marcus Carter isn't just going to stop at getting you fired. He's going to make sure you never wear a badge again." Grayson's chest tightened. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And the worst part? It was only just beginning. Grayson sat in his car outside the precinct, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His entire world had unraveled in less than 24 hours. Suspended, under investigation. The entire internet calling for his badge. He had always thought himself untouchable, just another cop doing his job, someone who could brush off accusations with a simple report and move on. But this was different. This wasn't some random kid without connections. This was Elijah Carter. And worse, this was Marcus Carter's son. Grayson's phone buzzed violently against the dashboard. He stared at it for a moment, knowing exactly what the call was about. When he finally picked up, a shrill voice pierced through the speaker. "Dan, what the hell is going on?" His wife, Linda. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" she shrieked. "I just had to pick the kids up from school early because they were getting harassed. Reporters were waiting outside our house, Dan. Our house. People are calling me a racist cop's wife." Grayson's stomach dropped. "Linda, I don't care, Dan. You need to fix this. Do you even understand what's happening? Marcus Carter is on national television right now. Right now." Grayson scrambled to turn on the news app on his phone. The screen loaded. And there he was. Marcus Carter, sitting across from one of the most well-known reporters in the country. His expression was calm, but serious. Deadly serious. "This isn't about my son," Marcus was saying. "This is about accountability. How many young black men go through this every single day, but no one listens because they don't have the privilege my son does? How many times have officers like Grayson gotten away with it?" The reporter nodded. "And what do you think should happen to him?" Marcus didn't even hesitate. He should be fired. He should never wear a badge again. And more importantly, the department needs to take a hard look at how many more like him are still out there. Grayson felt his vision blur. This was worse than he thought. His wife's voice broke through his haze. "Dan, you need to call someone, hire a lawyer, do something, because if Marcus Carter wants you gone, you're gone." For the first time in his life, Grayson felt powerless. This wasn't just an angry complaint at the station. This was a billionaire with influence, connections, and the full force of the media behind him. And Grayson? He was nothing in comparison. His phone buzzed again. A new email. Termination review hearing. Mandatory attendance. Grayson's heart nearly stopped. It was happening. Everything he thought he could brush off was now crashing down on him like an avalanche, and he had no idea how to stop it. Grayson sat stiffly in the cold metal chair of the hearing room, his pulse hammering in his ears. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the murmurs from the department officials, legal representatives and press outside the door only made it worse. He had been in interrogation rooms before, but never like this, never on the other side. At the front of the room sat Chief Reynolds, his face carved from stone, flanked by internal affairs officers and a city attorney. They all knew why they were here. Grayson had been a problem before. Complaints here and there, mostly dismissed as misunderstandings or overreactions. But this was undeniable. The door creaked open, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Marcus Carter had arrived. Dressed in a dark tailored suit, Marcus carried himself with the kind of presence that made people straighten up in their seats. He didn't need to demand respect. He already had it. And next to him, just as composed, was Elijah. Grayson barely recognized the young man from the traffic stop. That night he had looked like any other kid, just another black teenager behind the wheel of a luxury car. But now, with the weight of an empire behind him, Elijah looked every bit the heir to a billion-dollar legacy. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Grayson saw something that unsettled him more than Marcus's power or the threat of losing his job. Elijah wasn't angry. He was disappointed. Chief Reynolds cleared his throat. "Let's get started." The city attorney wasted no time. "Officer Grayson, you are here today in response to the formal complaint filed against you for racial profiling, misconduct, and abuse of power. Given the public outcry and recent viral evidence, this department is under immense scrutiny. We take these matters very seriously." Grayson swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. "You don't speak unless spoken to," the attorney cut in sharply. "We have reviewed the footage. We have listened to the audio. And more importantly, we have reviewed your record." Grayson stiffened. "Your pattern of targeting young black men, your history of unnecessary stops, and now your public humiliation of a law-abiding citizen, a billionaire's son no less, has placed this department in a position we cannot ignore." Reynolds exhaled sharply and leaned forward. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? Grayson felt sweat bead at his temple. I didn't know who he was. Marcus scoffed, a dry, humorless chuckle. And if he weren't my son? His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. What if Elijah was just another kid? Would you have pushed him harder? Would you have thrown him in cuffs? Grayson opened his mouth but couldn't find the words, because they all knew the answer. Marcus turned to the panel. I didn't come here today just for my son. This isn't about one bad cop or one bad night. This is about all the young men who don't have a billionaire father to make one phone call and turn the world upside down. His voice hardened. This is about every black boy who gets pulled over and doesn't know if he'll make it home. Elijah finally spoke. If my dad weren't Marcus Carter, I'd be another statistic. The room went silent. For the first time in his career, Grayson felt small. Reynolds rubbed his face and turned to the attorney. What's the recommendation? The attorney didn't hesitate. Termination. A sharp breath left Grayson's lungs. Just like that. His badge, his gun, his career, gone. Reynolds didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. Effective immediately. Grayson wanted to fight, wanted to argue, but what could he say? He had brought this on himself. The room began to empty, but before Marcus and Elijah left, Marcus turned back one last time. His gaze was unreadable, but his words cut deep. Maybe now you'll understand what it feels like to have your whole life decided by someone else's judgment. And with that, he walked out, leaving Grayson to drown in the consequences of his own actions. Grayson sat in his car outside the precinct, staring blankly at the badge in his trembling hands. It felt heavier than ever, not a symbol of authority, but a reminder of everything he had just lost. With a deep breath, he closed his fingers around the metal and squeezed until the edges dug into his skin. It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. He was no longer a cop. A knock on the window jolted him. He turned and saw his wife, Linda, standing outside, her arms crossed, her face a mixture of exhaustion and barely restrained anger. He hesitated before unlocking the door. She slid into the passenger seat, exhaling sharply as she looked at him. So, she said, her voice tight. It's official? Grayson didn't answer right away. He just tossed the badge onto the dashboard like it was worthless, because now it was. I got fired, he muttered. Linda closed her eyes, shaking her head. Jesus, Dan. Silence stretched between them. He could feel the weight of her disappointment pressing down on him, suffocating him more than the hearing, more than Marcus Carter's words. You did this to yourself, she finally said. Grayson's jaw tightened. He wanted to snap back, to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. Because she was right. I didn't think. No, you didn't. She cut him off. And now? The kids are getting bullied at school. We're getting hate mail. People are calling me names I can't even say out loud. You think losing your job is the worst part? You dragged all of us down with you. Grayson stared at the steering wheel, unable to meet her eyes. Linda shook her head, her voice quieter now. You never thought this could happen to you, did you? He didn't answer, because no, he hadn't. For years he had believed he was untouchable. He had stopped people like Elijah 100 times before, young black men in nice cars, wearing expensive clothes, living in neighborhoods he thought they didn't belong in. And every time he had walked away unscathed. But this time was different. This time, he had picked the wrong kid. Where are you going to work now? Linda's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Grayson let out a humorless laugh. Who the hell would hire me? She looked away, chewing on her lip. He could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her wanted to comfort him, but the other part, the bigger part, was still too angry. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down and sighed. It's the school. Another reporter showed up. She ran a hand down her face. "We can't live like this, Dan. We have to leave town." Grayson felt his stomach drop. Leave town. Everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his life, gone. And now, even his home wasn't safe. He swallowed hard, staring out at the city he had once believed he controlled. But now he was the one being watched, judged, and discarded. Now, he was the one who didn't belong. And for the first time in his life, Grayson finally understood how it felt. 2 weeks had passed, but for Grayson, it felt like years. The moment he lost his badge, his world crumbled faster than he could comprehend. His so-called brothers in blue stopped answering his calls. The department wanted nothing to do with him. The media wouldn't let up. News anchors dissected his downfall. Activists used his name as a rallying cry, and social media tore him apart. But none of that compared to the looks. At the grocery store, at the gas station, even walking down the street, people recognized him. And the ones who didn't recognize him, they still saw something. A disgraced man, a nobody, someone who didn't belong. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened. He had gone to a local diner, one he had been to 100 times before. The kind of place where the waitresses used to greet him with a smile, where people would nod respectfully when they saw his uniform. But today, he was just another face. Grayson sat alone at the counter, staring at the worn-out menu in front of him, though he wasn't really reading it. He could feel the whispers behind him, the way people would glance over, then quickly look away. Then a low voice came from behind him. Well, if it isn't Officer Grayson." His shoulders stiffened. He turned slightly, his eyes landing on a familiar face. Malcolm Reed. Malcolm was a community activist, someone Grayson had butted heads with more times than he could count. A black man who had called him out for racial profiling long before Elijah Carter entered the picture. But this time, Malcolm wasn't standing outside a police station, demanding justice. He was standing right here, in the same diner, looking down at Grayson with something dangerously close to pity. Grayson forced himself to hold Malcolm's gaze. "I'm not a cop anymore," he muttered. Malcolm smirked, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, I know." He tilted his head. "So tell me, how does it feel?" Grayson frowned. "How does what feel?" "To be on the other side." Something about the way he said it made Grayson's stomach twist. Malcolm continued, his voice calm, almost casual. "To be watched, judged, to walk into a place and feel the tension the moment you step in. To know people don't want you here." He let out a dry chuckle. "To have people look at you and make up their minds before you even open your mouth." Grayson swallowed. His hands curled into fists beneath the counter. "I didn't what?" Malcolm cut him off, his tone sharp. "Didn't mean to? Didn't think it would go this far? Didn't expect someone with power to actually hold you accountable?" Grayson didn't respond, because what could he say? Malcolm studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You had a choice, Grayson. Every time you pulled someone over, every time you assumed the worst, and now you know what it feels like to have the world assume the worst about you." A lump formed in Grayson's throat. Malcolm sighed, standing up straight. "I'm not gonna lie, man. There was a time I wanted to see you go through hell for what you did. But now," he exhaled, shaking his head, "I just hope you learn from it." And with that, Malcolm walked away, leaving Grayson alone with nothing but his thoughts. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, and he finally understood what it meant to be judged before being known. Grayson sat in his darkened living room, the only light coming from the flickering TV in front of him. He wasn't watching it, though. The sound was just background noise, something to fill the silence that had taken over his life. Linda had taken the kids to her mother's house for the weekend. Or maybe longer. She hadn't said when she'd be back, and he hadn't asked. He already knew what she was thinking. She was tired of him, tired of the mess he had made. He reached for his phone, hesitating before unlocking it. His social media was flooded with hate. His name was now a symbol, a warning, a headline, a lesson on what happens when a racist cop finally faces consequences. He used to be feared. Now he was nothing. His email inbox was no better. Job rejections. Some polite, most not. No one wanted to hire a former cop with a viral scandal attached to his name. Even the private security firms turned him away. Too much baggage, too much bad press. He had spent years wielding power over others. Now he couldn't even control his own future. A deep, aching shame settled in his chest. For so long, he had seen himself as one of the good ones. He had told himself he was just doing his job, that the people he pulled over deserved the suspicion. But now, sitting alone in a house that felt emptier by the day, he realized the truth. He had never really questioned what he was doing, not until it was his life on the line. A sudden knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His stomach clenched. He wasn't expecting anyone. Reporters had stopped coming days ago, but the paranoia hadn't left. Slowly he stood and walked to the door, hesitating before opening it. Elijah Carter stood on the porch. Grayson's breath caught. The young man was calm, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, something knowing. He had won, and they both knew it. "Surprised to see me?" Elijah asked. Grayson swallowed, gripping the doorframe. "What are you doing here?" Elijah shrugged. "Figured you should hear this from me." Grayson frowned. "Hear what?" A small smirk played at Elijah's lips, but it wasn't cocky. It was measured, controlled. "My dad's dropping the lawsuit." Grayson blinked, stunned. "What?" "You heard me," Elijah said. "We're not pushing for more. You lost your job, your reputation, your future. That's enough." Grayson stared at him, waiting for the catch. There had to be a catch. Elijah tilted his head. "But don't think this means you get to move on like nothing happened." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "Because the world won't forget. People like you, cops who think they can do whatever they want just because they've got a badge. You've gotten away with it for too long." Grayson felt his stomach twist. Elijah stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You used to have power. Now, the only thing people will remember you for is what you did that night." Grayson swallowed hard, his throat dry. Elijah let the silence hang between them before sighing. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," he finally said. "I just wanted you to know this." He gestured at the empty house behind Grayson. "This is what it feels like when people don't see you as human." Grayson flinched. Elijah nodded slowly. "Now you get to live with that." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Grayson standing in the doorway, hollow and exposed. For the first time, Grayson truly understood. This wasn't just punishment. This was a reckoning, and he had earned every second of it.